have a little bubble at the top right-hand corner of your screen. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the bubble. And when we have a good breaking point, we will answer your questions. And you know, we want to make this as easy as possible. I know it's probably not the easiest thing to learn, but remember at the end of this, there will be all types of informational things that you can go to. All of this is being recorded, and it will be put out there for your to be able to go out there and take a look at it and review at your convenience. I would remind anybody who happens to have their speakers on, please turn them off. And now we'll get started. Next page, please. We have, of course, my name's Carol Davis and Carrie Nino Kuntz, who are presenting this. Next page, please. And before I forget, I do want to thank Rebecca and our volunteer services for manning the screens. We were having difficulties getting this done, so she is manning the screens for us. Now, we'll go on what you need to know to meet the fiscal grants management requirements of Ohio AmeriCorps grants. Next screen, please. And on this next screen, it's the elements of the grants, and I'll just let you read that for a moment. Take a look at it. Okay, next screen, please. Regulations and requirements. Award recipients must read, understand, implement, and comply with all rules, regulations, and requirements of federal and AmeriCorps funds once you accept those federal funds. Compliance is not optional. There are consequences for this, and it varies depending on the nature and the severity of the non-compliance. For example, late reporting may result in suspension or loss of funding, or failure to document content may result in disallowed costs and having to repay the government, or even could include jail time. I must remind anybody who has their speakers on to please turn them off so everyone can hear the presentation. Thank you. Next slide, please. Award recipients must comply, but are not limited to the following. And you can take a look at the whole list of items that you must follow and comply to. Next screen, please. The topics that we are going to cover are written policies and procedures, internal controls, accounting system requirements, standards for documentation, common audit findings and problems, and the AmeriCorps guidance terms and conditions. Next slide, please. Documentation standards, personnel expenses. Charges for salaries and wages must be based on records that accurately reflect the work performed. These records must be supported by a system of internal control which provides reasonable assurance the charges are accurate, allowable, and properly allocated, be incorporated into the official records of the organization, reflect the total activity for which the employee is compensated, support the distribution of salaries and wages chargeable between this grant and other programs or functions if the employee is less than 100% on the AmeriCorps grant. Next slide, please. Documentation of staff time is based on uniform guidance. Serve Ohio expects programs use timesheets and/or activity reports to track staff time. Any alternate mechanism must receive prior approval by OCSV. Timesheets must their total hours each day account for total activity of employees, not just the time spent on AmeriCorps only.
I'm just listening to the AmeriCorps thing.
Okay. If we got good cards and tap on to make sure we don't need those.
If anyone has the speakers on,
So wait, so they just sent us an unsolicited gift card? And she's going to just use it to.
okay, I'm going to continue. I apologize.
I still think she should probably.
Okay, timesheets must show
Don't really
each
scan it
day.
and take. I mean, it should go into.
Employee
I mean, we should be accounting for it somehow so that we know that it's not just coming in and being used by the director for personal stuff. So I would think that we would want to,
file.
you know, at least have a record of it, and then that gets, and then some documentation of how she's, like receipts how she spent.
They must be completed after the fact, must be based on actual, not budgeted time. Organizations may estimate time on an interim basis, but ultimately must show they are charging based on time and activity data and not charging grants based on budgeted time. They must be prepared at least monthly and coincide with your pay periods. Next slide, please. We're going to staff and time attendance. An example of an accountability problem would be time and effort not properly documented on the timesheets. Let's say time is based on budget actual after the fact reported on the timesheets. If they're not signed by supervisor and employee, or hours are incorrect, missing timesheets, staff allocating time to more than one grant, and are not keeping timesheets that show actual time spent on each grant. The remedy would be periodically conduct your own timesheet review. Ensure you have a system of internal controls on timekeeping in line with the uniform guidance. Next slide, please. We're going to cost sharing or match. Matching funds and all contributions, including cash and third-party in-kind contributions, must be accepted when they meet all the following criteria: are verifiable from the non-federal entities' records, are not included as contributions for any other federal award, are necessary and reasonable for accomplishment of project or program objectives, are allowable under some Part E cost principles of this part, are not paid by the federal government under another federal award, except where the federal statute authorizing a program specifically provides that the federal funds made available for such program can be applied to matching or cost sharing requirements of other federal programs, are provided for in the approved budget when required by the federal awarding agency, and to conform to other provisions of this part as applicable. Next slide, please.
Hey, Carol, before I move to the next slide, there is a question. So can you please confirm electronic signatures are acceptable?
We're not set up for that yet. So in this case, at this time, no. Okay, are we ready? Next slide is cost share.
Sorry, Carol, just a clarification. Audrey asks on timesheets for the agency.
Yes.
Okay.
For the agency, yes.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, we're going to go on with our cost sharing or match. Here's an example of an accountability problem. The match is not met, undocumented or insufficient, unallowable. Subgrantee claims match for an activity that doesn't appear in an approved budget. Unreasonable, which would be subgrantee claims match that is excessive. Not approved in budget. Subgrantee substitutes match for activities not in the approved budget. Uses unauthorized federal funds, which you can't do. Your remedy would you need to make sure claim match is reasonable and included in the approved budget and supports approved activities. Request budget modification if necessary. Record all claim match in accounting journals. Make sure claimed match is appropriate and supporting documentation is maintained. Make sure match is allowable. Next slide, please. Accountability issues with in-kind would be with insufficient documentation, would have the same, if they have the same documentation requirements as other expenditures, would be insufficient if you didn't have documentation that was kept to support the value placed on the contribution. And if documentation doesn't have staff hours explicitly identified to remedy the problem, create a form on which third-party donors can record in-kind support, form in-kind staff time, maintain a timesheet that differentiates between AmeriCorps and non-AmeriCorps time, and tracks actual hours. Next slide, please. Organization, accounting requirements, internal controls. The non-federal entity must establish and maintain effective internal control over the federal award that provides reasonable assurance that the non-federal entity is managing the federal award in compliance with federal statutes, regulations, and terms and conditions of the federal award. These internal controls should be in compliance with guidance and the standards for internal control in the federal government issued by the Comptroller General of the United States or the Internal Control Integrated Framework issued by the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treasury Commission. Next slide, please. Common audit findings. Inadequate internal controls. Costs not allocated properly. Financial reporting incomplete. Lack of written policies and procedures. And separation of duties. How to fix this? You should segregate financial responsibilities of staff. Review and reconcile budget to actual expenditures for accuracy prior to report submission. Keep a clear audit trail that properly documents and records expenses. And of course, follow your written policies and procedures. Next slide, please. You should retain documentation that supports staff time spent on the grant. Prepare all financial reports with information from the accounting system. Adequate review process for financial reports and budgets. Adequate cash management procedures. monthly bank reconciliations. We need a system to follow upon identified problems to ensure a resolution. Next slide, please. This is for other CNCS common OIG audit findings. The FFRs do not reconcile to internal accounting records. Costs incurred outside of the budget period are charged to the grant. Organizations do not separate accounting records for different funding sources. Next slide, please. Solid grant fiscal management. All the required financial systems, policies, and procedures and separation of duties are in place and followed. Then have consistent checks and balances established, written, so that everyone follows them. Next slide, please. Accounting system requirements. 1, be able to document and verify all costs, grant and match, cash and in kind. Record in kind as revenue and expense. Account for each award and grant separately. Record financial transactions by budget line item and program year. Distinguish between federal and non-federal funds. Distinguish between direct and indirect costs. Provide management with financial reports at both the summary or detailed levels that will compare budget to actual amounts. Correlate financial reports submitted to OCSV directly to accounting information and supporting documents. Next slide, please. Adequate documentation. Expenditures documentation should support an expense from initiation to payment. Staff employee or in kind is on timesheets. In kind will use the third party in kind form to document. Next slide, please. Requirements of document descriptions. Descriptions on payment documents must adequately prove the expenses charged to awards are allowable, reasonable, and allocable. Allocables are in accordance with the terms and conditions of the award and as specified in the narrative and budget. Reasonable is what a prudent person would spend. Allocable is necessary and charged in proportion to the benefit received. Next slide, please. Good descriptions. The who, the what, the where, the when, and the why. So we have a sample of using who, what, where, when, and why. Sample description. Travel by employee X from October 22nd of 2020 through October 23rd of 2020 to Columbus to attend and participate in Serve Ohio's conference on service and volunteering. Information gained from this conference will enhance employees' knowledge about service and volunteerism. Next slide, please. Good descriptions. What happens if good descriptions and adequate documentations are not provided? This can be deemed as an improper payment and disallowed. Remedy: verification to ensure compliance and avoid disallowed costs. Verify the adequacy of descriptions and supporting documentation. Provide clarifications or additional documentation as needed. Next slide, please. Governing authorities are listed below. It starts with the legislative and regulatory services and the entities underneath that. Then there are other applicable terms and conditions listed under that, which, as I said before, all of the stuff that I skip is all available to you out there on Serve Ohio's website for you to get to. Next slide, please. Terminology and acronyms. Serve Ohio is OCSV. NOGA is Notice of Grants Award. And OSTC is Ohio AmeriCorps Supplementary Terms and Conditions. Next slide, please. Ohio supplementary terms and conditions, you would need to see OSTC-5 and OSTC-6 for grants and financial management requirements. Next slide, please. And 5.7 of the OSTC, it lists 3 items. All subgrantees must submit to fully execute your award before you can request funds. You need the notice of a grant award signature page, subgrantee audit determination form, and copy of liability insurance policy showing adequate coverage. Subgrantees new to receiving funds through the state must register as a state of Ohio supplier in the supplier portal and register for the EFT payment. Next slide, please. Financial reporting and encores. Cost reimbursement subgrantees use Encore's online reporting system for all financial reporting unless otherwise noted. Fixed amount subgrantees do not use Encore's for financial reporting. They are excluded from the reporting discussed on the next few slides, including the Periodic Expense Report, or PER, Aggregated Financial Report, AFRs, Unused Funds Estimate and Reporting, and other funds, federal funds. Next slide, please. Encores. Once your program officer gives you access, set the notifications to receive emails or homepage notifications from OSCV when financial reports are approved or returned. In order to do this, you log in. Then on the menu bar, you can go to the Tools, Administrative Tools, Email Notifications, and the Off-On to set it. Next slide, please. Once you've been set up in Encores and have your notifications set, you will submit approved e-grants budget in Encores within 15 days of receiving the NOGA. Next slide, please. Okay, submitting PERs in Encores, the basic rule for all reports. You submit it in Encores as a on time without errors. Late reports are recorded for consideration in grant renewal process. Failure to report may result in suspension of your funding. So it's really, really important for you guys to get your information submitted on time in Encores. Per extension request must be submitted 2 business days in advance of the due date. Please email it to your fiscal officer. Next slide, please. Periodic expense report. Required quarterly. but may be submitted once a month if requesting funds. They must show federal and match expenditures according to budget category by line item. Show match percentage being met on subgrantee spending, including match on OCSV administrative share. So that's that 2%. PER is used to show 100% of grant spending and used as grant payment process. Next slide, please. The next slide is reporting periods and due dates, and this is for your reference. So we'll go on to the next slide. Budget changes. You need to discuss any budget changes that you may have with your program officer first. Then you submit a budget modification request in AmeriCorps for changes exceeding the 10% of total budget. Under 10% of the total budget does not require a budget modification. Approved budget lines may be over or under spent as necessary. The exceptions are expenditures requiring specific prior written approval, or if adding cost to a budget line or category that had a zero amount in the approved budget. A budget modification is required regardless of the amount. And we're talking about if the amount was zero and the original approved. This applies to formula and competitive funded programs. In addition, for competitive funded programs, changes must be approved by CNCS via grant amendment. Next slide, please. We're moving on to how to request funds from the grant. And next slide. Fixed amount subgrantees. Submit the request for funds, fixed amount form, and an eGrant drawdown calculations and amounts report. Submit request via email, signed and scanned, of course, to my attention. Cost reimbursement subgrantees will submit payments requests in AmeriCorps using the periodic expense report, PER, payment calculator, the payment calculator box located in the PER report. No advance payment requests are allowed except for initial startup costs only and must be reconciled in accordance with CFR 200.305. Payment will be made with each PER submission. Next slide, please. Member stipend guidance. Members only receive a stipend while they are serving. A living allowance is not a wage. It's not paid on an hourly basis. It's paid in regular increments, such as biweekly or monthly. Payment should not fluctuate based on the member's start date or the number of hours served in a particular time period. Payments can only be held if member is suspended. Payments must cease when a member ends a term of service. Next slide, please. We're going to go into an example here of member living allowance so you can get some idea of what we're talking about. There is to be no lump sum payments to any members. If a member serves 1,700 hours and ends their term of service before the agreed upon end date, program may not provide a lump sum. to that particular member. If a member enrolls after the program start date, the program must provide regular living allowance payments from the member's beginning date and may not recalculate to increase the member's living allowance or provide a lump sum. Next slide, please. Distribution of member stipend computation. Determine the length of your program, such as 12 months. Determine the number of stipend payments to distribute over the length of the program, which would be, if you're using 12 months, 26. Compute the stipend by dividing the total stipend amount by the number of payments. Next slide, please. Here is an example of a member living allowance. If the program is 12 months, the number of stipend payments would be 26 pays biweekly. Stipend increment would be $14,279 over the full length of the time divided by the 26 gives you $549.19 of pay. So that would follow through each pay period. So if you have one member times 26 pays at $549.19, each pay will total up. Once you total all of those pays up, it will equal the $14,279. Next slide, please. Member living allowance distribution. This is OCSB guidance. Establish a written policy that is reasonable and followed consistently. Outlining your practice of distributing the living allowance for full-time and less than full-time members, including half-time members serving in a full-time capacity. Establish a policy for members that start late or exit early. The policy may reflect when a member starts within the first 2 weeks of the month, you may pay them the entire living allowance. For example, if they start late, you can prorate the amount based on the number of days, not hours, that they serve. The policy would hold true for the end of service. If they leave within the first 2 weeks of the month, their living allowance is based on the number of days in the month that they serve. You can establish different cutoff points as long as they are reasonable, documented in policy, and followed consistently. Next slide, please. Full-time member stipend payment distribution, an example. Program X has a 12-month tutoring program beginning on August 1st to 20 and ending July 31st to 21. The core consists of all full-time members. Member stipend payments are set up and distributed over the length of the program in equal increments across the 26 pays. Program X enrolls 15 of its 20 members on August 1st of 20. If they end on time as scheduled, they will receive their entire stipend. Full-time members may be enrolled up to 45 days after the program start date. Program X enrolls the other 5 members on 9/1 of 20. Their stipend payments will be set up in the same equal increments as the other full-time members who started in August. If they are allowed to serve after the program end date for the full 12 months, they may receive the entire stipend. If they cannot serve after the program end date, they will receive the amount of stipend for the period they serve. Next slide, please. Half-time member stipend payment distribution, another example for you guys. Half-time members, starting at the beginning of the program, will have their stipend payments distributed evenly over 12 months. They may start up to 6 months after the program start date and serve in a full-time capacity. If so, their stipend will be divided evenly over a 6-month period. In all cases, the member contract will be written to reflect members' actual start-end dates and distribution amount of the stipend payment set up accordingly in the accounting system. Next slide, please. Okay, for a visual, you can see AC member stipend distribution sample on the website under Program Director Resources, Financial Management Sources. Next slide, please. This one's for members who need to complete their terms of service after the program end date. Subgrantee will request a no-cost member extension for members who need to complete their terms of service after the period of performance end date. Request is to be sent in writing to program officer 30 days prior to the original end date. Serve Ohio will amend the NOGA. Next slide, please. Financial monitoring. They are risk-based assessments will be decided upon the following. It could be financial management survey, it could be periodic expense review, or just basic reviews. What determines what type of review you'll have is through the financial surveys and the periodic expense reviews. You could end up having an on-site visit or a desk review or just a transaction detail review for monitoring. Next slide, please. We want to make a note that Ohio subgrantees are not allowed to subgrant funds. If your partners are contributing in kind towards your match, such as for office space or for staff or supervisory time, in addition to the appropriate documentation for distribution of funds, you must also document how you are monitoring in-kind funds and where those funds are going to. This is to ensure that they comply with the federal guidelines. Next slide, please. Annual grant reconciliation. Grants are reconciled annually. In addition to the final PER, an AFR, which is the aggregate financial report, is required. Must be signed by an official with legal authority to bind the organization. Final subgrantee match must meet statutory match requirement and voluntary cost share, as stated in the Notice of Grant Award, and compliance on OCSV's administrative share. Any unused grant funds revert to OCSV. And you can go to the next slide. Basically, what we have in all of the slides afterwards would be a bunch of informational slides that we're going to allow you to go out and use as your resources as you're opening up, especially for the new people opening up their new subgrants. We would now like to just stop, and this is basically the end of it, so we didn't hold you too long. but we would like to take any questions that you may have and get them answered now. If we do not have the answers, we will let you know and get back with you as soon as possible and let everyone know in the group what that answer would be. So are there any questions for the end of this training?
One question I see in the chat box is, can you email the slides?
Yes, we can email this out to all the subgrantees if you like. Sure.
Great.
Karen,
just one other question. Karen is asking, she said she was confused at the end when you said subgrantees are not allowed to subgrant funds. They're paying their site supervisors. Can you just explain that a little bit more, Carol, please?
It means that you cannot subgrant it out to like another entity outside of your program. All of those funds have to stay within your program. Does that make sense? Hopefully that answers your question. If not, we just get a hold of us and we'll talk to you later. Are there any other questions?
Haley asked if we'll be sharing the recording, and I can definitely post this to the website if that's something, Carol and Carrie, that you'd like to do. So let me know and I'd be happy to post this to the website. It should be up later on today.
Yeah, that's great. Are we done with the questions?
I don't see any additional questions in the chat box. If anybody has any additional questions, please post them at this time. And I'll let you know, Carol, if anything else pops up in the next minute or so.
Okay, well, I would say that evidently we're really good or we really confused you all. So if you come up with any other questions, feel free to contact Carrie or I. We're more than welcome. Glad to help you out. Anything that we don't have an answer right away, we will be more than happy to get the answers and get back with you. So listen, we both appreciate you all taking your time out of your day to come support us and learn more about the really a very important part of your taking on federal grants. So I'm going to say goodbye and have a great day.